Hello, welcome all attendees. Thank you for joining us today. This is a continuation of the 2020 Phoenix LiDAR webinar series. My name is Conrad Quinterno from Phoenix LiDAR Systems, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. Phoenix LiDAR Systems specializes in building customizable survey-grade mapping solutions. We build hardware to support a variety of remote sensing applications, and we also develop the software necessary to create actionable data products. Here at Phoenix LiDAR Systems, we are pioneers in the field of LiDAR mapping systems. In addition to our tried and true LiDAR packages, we are eager to integrate other sensors that are on the bleeding edge of remote sensing technology. We've configured payloads for a variety of vehicles, done multi-camera integrations, and built systems with advanced imaging sensors such as thermal and hyperspectral. So that leads us to today's topic, LiDAR and hyperspectral system integrations. We are going to be joined by a very special guest speaker, Dr. Eben Broadbent from the Spatial, Ecology, and Conservation Lab at University of Florida. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Broadbent. To start off today's discussion, I will be presenting a very high-level introduction to hyperspectral imagery, sort of aimed at new users who are curious what it even is, why it's useful, and some of the essential pre-analysis processing steps. Afterwards, we'll be giving the spotlight to Dr. Broadbent to tell us about his lab and talk about the fascinating ways that they're utilizing this technology. Then, as usual, we will have a bit of time for question and answer to end the webinar. This color information is collected and stored in 3 broad channels, blue, green, and red, and then combined to make the full color images that we're accustomed to looking at. You can kind of see an example of that on the upper right there. Hyperspec, on the other hand, collects narrow spectral bands, around 5 nanometers each in this case, across a broad region of the spectrum. So instead of just 3 channels that are summarizing red, green, and blue, the spectrum is collected in hundreds of bands, showing much greater spectral detail about the objects being viewed. The hyperspectral imagery that we're speaking about today is made of light from the visible as well as the near-infrared region, so 400 to 1,000 nanometer wavelengths. This means that we can see how the subjects of our imagery are interacting with infrared light that's not visible to the human eye. How is hyperspectral data used? So the hundreds of spectral bands that are collected get stored at the pixel level. So each pixel in a hyperspectral image has, in this case, 270 different spectral values. Plotting these spectral values for a pixel, or more specifically for the object seen in that pixel, shows us the spectral response of that object. These spectral response curves, like shown in that graphic, can differ greatly between different objects in a scene. And the way that they really show the way that these objects interact differently with light. And that can give us a lot of insight into objects' physical properties, like plant cell structure, water content, chemical composition, for example. And with these insights, they help with a variety of analysis routines like segmentation, identification, etc. How is this data processed? Now that we have an idea of what the data is and why it can be useful, I guess it's important to understand two of the common pre-processing or pre-analysis processing steps. Generally, radiometric corrections are performed. Raw digital values are what is collected and stored at first. These don't really have a real world meaning, and that makes it difficult to draw comparisons amongst different data sets. So we perform radiometric corrections first by using sensor-specific factory calibrations, generally bias and gain values, to convert raw digital numbers to radiance. Radiance is the amount of radiation coming from an object. And these values are highly affected by other sources, like atmospheric absorption, as an example. So the next step that we take is to convert these radiance images to reflectance. And reflectance shows us the proportion of light reflecting from a surface compared to how much was incoming. That makes the data more quantitatively comparable amongst different data sets. So that's step one, is radiometric corrections. The next step is geometric corrections. Hyperspectral imagery is collected in a line scan pattern. That means that a single row of pixels is collected at each exposure. You might have also heard of this referred to as a push broom type of scanner. So to contrast that with a typical digital camera, a digital camera might collect frames that are 6,000 by 4,000 pixels, while a line scanner, in this case, collects 640 by 1. So the resulting raw image is a continuous column of frames. You can see in the raw image that we have on the screen how content appears distorted, and that's actually the movement of the aircraft that you're able to see. So it's important to straighten these things out and get objects put into the correct location or rectified. And to do that, we need a high quality trajectory and a surface model to project the pixels onto. So that aspect of the process is pretty similar to the orthorectification that you may be used to. There are quite an enormous amount of types of analysis that can be made with hyperspectral data. Here we're showing an example of where we've combined hyperspec and LiDAR data to try to identify different plant types in our survey area. The process that we took, after completing radiometric and geometric corrections, was to use the hyperspec values and height values that were derived from LiDAR in an unsupervised classification routine. We used a k-means classifier, which looked at the spectral and spatial attributes and grouped pixels into probable plant types. These groups are symbolized in the LiDAR point cloud by random unique colors that you can see in the screen grab. So this is just sort of one example of how we've been able to combine these two remote sensing technologies. You can take a closer look at this example on Phoenix's website. That was my high-level overview of what hyperspec is and kind of why it's useful. So without any further ado, I'd like to, I guess, reintroduce Dr. Broadbent and learn a little bit about his work.
Great, thank you, Conrad, and thank you, Phoenix, for the invitation. My name's Eben Broadbent. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at the University of Florida. I am jointly in the Forest Ecology department and the geomatics department. So I cross the bridge between the technology and its applications. My background is actually botany, tropical botany undergrad. Then I did tropical forestry and then biology and ecology for my PhD, followed by postdocs in large-scale global modeling. So, but during my PhD, I was at Stanford University working with some pretty fancy aircraft systems called, in particular, the Carnegie Airborne Observatory. And this was, 15 years ago, this was probably one of the very first, if not only ones that was doing sensor fusion, really at an incredible scale, fusing LiDAR and hyperspectral, visual. And back then, this was something that you really didn't hear about at all, other than if you wanted hyperspectral, you might be talking to NASA and trying to get avarice overflown your areas, and very, very sophisticated technology, which now has come to the point where we're having a discussion here, a webinar about drones having similar type of sensors, obviously different ranges and signal to noise ratios and all of these other numbers. But the fact that we have these sensors now on a drone is really a total ground changer in terms of what we can do, and in particular where we can do it, and also how much it costs to do it. And these are just total changing the environment for what we're able to do and the types of questions we can ask. Back 10 years ago, you wanted to fly the same plot 10 times during the course of a day for some research question. You'd need a major research grant to even consider such a thing, hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million, because you're flying aircraft with pilots and co-pilots and all these other equipment. But now, we have our system, for example, Gator Eye, and then, we can just bring some soda and hang out there, spend the day and just do a flight every couple hours. There's still costs. It's not free. And, compared to flying your DJI Phantom around, yeah, it's expensive. And I've got other presentations that talk about the cost differences, but really it's not about the cost. However, the cost is the cost per what we're able to do. In fact, over small areas, collecting data that can be equal or much better than what you can get from an aircraft is just amazing. So this is really just exciting across all disciplines. And our lab has collaborations with lots of different people on all different kinds of topics, because understanding the three-dimensional structure, composition, health of the landscapes is just intrinsic to virtually any type of research or academic or for-profit type enterprises. So the Spatial Ecology and Conservation Lab, I co-direct that with my wife, who's also a faculty member, Dr. Angelica Almeida. We actually met at the University of Florida in 2002, and we've been having our academic science adventures around the world since then, also getting our masters here and PhDs at Stanford together and going on. And so we really were inspired by working with these aircraft systems, and we said, can we do this in a drone? Because we want to be able to ask these types of questions that integrate the three-dimensional structure of ecosystems with information about their health, their species composition, questions like invasive species, these types of things. And so at a cost that we could potentially afford. And so then, working with Phoenix now for a number of years, really inspired Phoenix, and then Headwall came together and just tried to build, or successfully built, this system. And now we've been really pushing it all over the world. And I'm going to talk some about those projects as I come along. So the name Gator Eye, coming here to the University of Florida, we're the Florida Gators, that's our mascot. So everything's Gators, Gatorade, that came from Florida. So the Gator Eye, it's perfect. And it just happened that, the full name is the Gator Eye Unmanned Flying Laboratory, the UFL. It's just memorable and good. So you can see we have a website down here in the lower left-hand corner. So you can see some of the specs here. We've been working in detail with Phoenix now for 4 years, since conception all the way through various different generations of this system. And, adding new sensors as we go, figuring out how to integrate them, software sides, just so many interesting technical challenges to overcome and to get us to the point where we're now really pushing application challenges, which is, where we wanted to be all along anyways, but we had to build it. And so we've got a LiDAR sensor. In this particular case, we have the VLP32 Ultra Puck you go to the Phoenix website, you'll find the base model and into which we integrated all the other sensors labeled as in Ultra Scout. And so that has the STIM 300 IMU. And so that's a pretty good inertial motion unit. And that's a, for this system, I'm really very pleased with this LiDAR unit. It's phenomenal. It's lightweight, it's very robust and small. So then on the bottom we have a high-res visual camera. It's 20, I believe 25 megapixels. And then up on the back side here we have a thermal camera. So that has a custom shutter, but actually it's a full custom casing around the thermal camera. And so it's pretty interesting. I've been talking to and working with people who are experts on thermal camera systems, and in fact just recently down in Costa Rica, and they were really saying how they've been suffering so many complaints during conferences and trying to publish their papers about this vignetting of the lens that happens. And basically what happens is that if you don't have this really excellent custom designed external components, then as the system is moving through the air and as it interacts with the environment, it heats at different levels. And actually that the non-equal heating of all those components results in issues with the actual thermal imagery data. And so this has the customized shell, which basically has a fan, and Ben and others here can really get more into the details, but it's able to push through enough air and has these other components to really have a much more normalized thermal heating around the entire camera, even during flight. And you get just beautiful images. And they were really impressed by the lack of vignetting on this. And so I'm really excited about that and fusing it with everything else, because more than anything, the Gator Eye is a data fusion system. And as far as I'm aware, it's one of the best. The Hyperspectral system you can see here is the Nano system from Headwall. We fully integrated that. We control it through Spatial Explorer. Eventually, real time, along with all these other sensors. It has its own separate hard drive, so it actually has internal to it a 500 gig hard drive. Internal to the Scout is another 500 gig hard drive. So you can turn them all off and on from Spatial Explorer, which is the custom software that Phoenix has developed. It's excellent. It provides real-time way to control and visualize data, but also in post-processing in a newer version, you can just do lots of really sophisticated analyses, both very basic from producing, simple LiDAR. Your speaker is not working. I just got a chat pop up here. Conrad, can you confirm, is that coming to me?
Let me take a look.
It says your speaker is not working. Please check your connection or use a different speaker.
We're garbled for a little bit, Eben, Dr. Broadbent, but it's fine now. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's all good to me. Oh, I think you're on mute now, actually. There we go.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, there's some little issues appearing on this. I do have a backup system next to my phone, but just let me know if you're not able to hear me, and I'll keep talking clearly here. So then I was describing the hardware a bit more. So then we have that 500 gig hard drive internal to the Scout, and another 500 gigs internal to the Nano. The thermal, the visual, and the LiDAR go to the Scout, and the Nano hyperspectral data is stored inside the Nano itself. So then after a flight, we need to download from both of those systems. During a flight with all sensors going, we collect about 3 to 4, probably about 4 gigabytes of data per minute. So we are a massive data generation machine. Following that, we get back to the lab, we download, and then in post-processing, it usually doubles or triples depending on what we're doing. And so we have a lot of data, and we have a lot that we're dealing with in terms of backing up data and playing with it. 100 terabytes of data that we have backed up and that we're working on from all these sensors. So really exciting system, and we're just at the cusp now of really applying all of these data and analyses, as I'm going to show you in the next slides here.
Yeah, thanks for the breakdown. I think I've heard someone refer to your guys' Gator Eye as the Swiss Army knife. which I think is...
We collect all the data, and sometimes we're not sure what we're going to do with some of the sensors, but usually there's somebody interested in that type of data.
All right, well, let's move ahead and look at some examples of the kind of work that you're doing. First, yeah.
So the beauty about collecting lots of different types of data is that if you actually think about yourself and your body, a human is an incredible data fusion system. If you lost your ability to view, your eyes, you've very much limited your understanding in the area, your ability to touch. You have a very limited perspective. And so you really need to have all of that data. You need it all functioned, time synchronized, spatially aligned, foresighted, in order to really have a full understanding of what's happening in the world. And so when we talk about hyperspectral data, we're talking about LiDAR, or even talking about things like visual, because they all form equal components to whatever the aspect is that we're interested in. For example, if you're thinking about forest structure, you can see here that the LiDAR gives you this incredible ability to understand the three-dimensional structure of a particular forest. So in red here, you can see an example that I've been working on with Jason Vogel, also from the University of Florida. And this is an interesting experimental site. They have actually been manually removing the understory, and it's going to be perfect for testing our sensors. And then they're also doing nutrient additions. So they're adding nitrogen, they're adding phosphorus, and they're coupling it with changes in the vertical structure. So that's pretty great. So you can see here how well the LiDAR will pull out the differences in the understory vegetation density by looking at the entire three-dimensional point cloud itself. So in addition to that, we've come up with our own suite of algorithms that the Gator uses to provide custom and one-of-a-kind deliverables. And that's something that I've been working heavily also with postdocs and other students of mine. One of the things that we do is we actually retrace every single LiDAR pulse through its entire trajectory from being launched to its impact. And we figure out how many times every single voxel or volumetric pixel has been sampled, meaning that a laser has passed through it. So it turns out when people talk about how many pulses they have per square meter, and say you're flying an aircraft and you want biomass, you might hear somebody say, you got to have 4 pulses per square meter on the ground, otherwise you're going to not be getting good biomass estimates. Well, the number you don't hear that's actually pretty amazing is that when we fly over a place or another drone that's similar with this wide field of view, you're actually getting 30 to 40,000 samples per square meter. That's totally mind-blowing, and that's not a number that you hear. How's that possible? It's because most of those pulses are simply passing through voxels in which there aren't any vegetation or types of structures that are actually resulting in impacts. But that data, for me, is as meaningful as the impact data. And so once you start applying this algorithm,
sorry, but I believe you're dropping out a bit. Can you confirm that, Conrad?
Yeah, it's starting to sound a little shaky. Maybe switching to the backup audio is a good idea.
Or if you could disable the video. I'm not sure what the cause is.
Might be there. Let me. Okay, let me. I'm gonna switch to my backup audio here. Okay.
Check. And now we can hear you twice, so please mute.
I'm sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. I just switched to my phone for audio, and well, actually, I'm still on my computer here. So, all right. That's why I always have my phone ready and the computer, because you never know what's going to happen. So we're good.
Well prepared. Thank you, Evan.
Welcome. So then what you can do is, after you've come up with this idea of sampling voxels versus intercepting within voxels, you actually can come up with a percentage density for every single voxel, which we then have converted through sophisticated models relating to leaf area density and, you know, how does light pass through forests and things like that into leaf area density, where we can actually say what is the likely area of leaves per voxel with an uncertainty value, and then we can look at the vertical profile in these quantities throughout the entire forest. And you get a very good understanding of where are the leaves in the forest, how do they differ between plots with different biodiversity, as we see in this image here on the right, these vertical profile, or you can sum them up and you get something that's standard and commonly used called leaf area index. And that's basically how dense are the leaves in that whole area. And because this approach uses all the data, we can actually do it at a very fine resolution, which is 1 square meter versus, you know, other approaches that would need to be working at much larger areas. So we've got a very unique LiDAR deliverable here that we're very excited about, and we're starting to push ahead a lot. This is also really important because so we can go to the next slide now. This is really important because there's big differences between hyperspectral data and LiDAR data. So yes, there's a lot of structural data that you can derive from hyperspectral signals. And yes, there's a lot of compositional and health data that you can get from LiDAR data. But when it really comes down to what are they best serve their best purpose, LiDAR is a structural assessment tool, and now in 3 dimensions, looking at all aspects throughout forests and other ecosystems. And the hyperspectral is how you understand what it is that you now understand the structure of. Questions like, is it healthy? Is it having leaf off? Is it water stressed? Is there nutrient stress? Is it a highly diverse environment or not? These are types of questions that you can get at now using hyperspectral data and the huge wealth of hyperspectral theory that's been going on in this field for 30, 40 years now, using mostly aircraft systems and then more recently some satellite systems. But really this has been an aircraft field or a field in the field system using some backpack mounted hyperspectral units. So as Conrad was talking about, you can get a lot of information from the different light spectra that come across here. So most of what the hyperspectral signal is actually outside the realm of what our eyes can see. And that's pretty interesting. Our eyes are probably looking in about the 400 to 700 nanometer range, whereas the nano is collecting data from about 354 up through about 1050. So what you see here, in this case, going all the way up to 2400 nanometers, that is available, for example, from Headwall, but that's a much bigger camera that has a lot of other issues, and it's heavy, and you know it requires a totally different system. However, you can get a huge amount of information at the high spatial resolution that we get with the Nano, all just using the data up to about 1050, including you can see here all types of aspects relating to leaf physiology, carotenoids, anthocyanins. These are the things that give it color. Chlorophyll, that's like what's making it green. You know, a green leaf is healthy. And then you can start to get idea about water concentration. And then those vary between tree species. So now you can start to get an idea of diversity of the environments. And then you can apply 100 other different types of vegetation indices that are well used in the literature to give you different types of specific values like nitrogen or things like that. So really the ultimate goal is what we see on the right side here, and that is the full fusion of our different sensors in order to use them, to fully use them for what they best do in order to understand that system at the maximum capability that we can from this technology. And with that information, then address questions that we think are worth our time and money to ask. So that's kind of, it's the same as like, all right, I'm going to take the time to go out into this forest and walk around for a research reason. Why is it worth my time? It's the same question when you're collecting it with your drone system. So yeah, we can go to the next one. However, hyperspectral imagery is actually much more complicated than LiDAR data to understand and to pre-process. And that's just the truth of it. Light it's very different when you're using light from an external source. So that's a critical and huge difference between any of these optical sensors. They're called optical passive and versus LiDAR, which is active. And so those terms refer to the fact that passive sensor gets its energy input from a different source, typically the sun. And LiDAR is actually shooting pulses of light itself and generates those itself. So you could fly your LiDAR sensor at night and collect equally good data. In fact, it might even be better. I haven't done the test, but there is less potential of interference in that same frequency, I could imagine. No information to back up that statement, but just logic there. So, however, the hyperspectral data comes from the sun, and the sun is 8 minutes away at light speed plus, 100 kilometers of, potential other obstructions in our atmosphere going all the way up. And then, then even once you get down into the forest, then there's so many issues relating to if it's not shaded by a cloud, then there's other areas of shade. As we can see in this image here, there's gaps in the forest. Things have structure. The sun is over in one area, and then the tree crown is now shading the backside of it. And unfortunately, the models, in order to model out shade that happens down at the ecosystem level, are not fully advanced to be ready to go. It's extremely challenging. So the easiest thing you can do in order to get useful data is you identify what areas are fully sun illuminated. So there's a number of steps here, and I probably should have included a graph. But so the best way to figure out what portions of your study area are fully illuminated by the sun, meaning they don't have a branch in between them or another tree, is we use a ray tracing approach. Basically, the same as you would if you're out in the forest and you're trying to find the sun. You look around until it hits you in the eye. Well, there's a ray, a line connecting you and the sun and your eye. And if there's an obstruction, you don't get blinded, and it's better that way. But so we basically, for every single pixel, every single time the Nano opens its shutter, or the integration time, we calculate exactly where the sun was at that moment. We ray trace it down into the digital surface model. So now, even in the pre-processing, we're fusing all of our different types of sensor technologies and deliverables. So now we can actually identify what portions of any area of interest are fully illuminated by the sun at that minute. And so you can see that down here in A, where you see a digital surface model in high resolution. And then in B, where in black, you actually see portions of the landscape that for that precise moment that the Nano was imaging that pixel are now fully illuminated by the sun. Everything else is basically, it's contaminated, and trying to uncontaminate it is very tricky at this moment. However, you don't need to have wall-to-wall data for hyperspectral. The beauty of it is you don't need that. What you need is a sample of good data. And then the best, if you want to understand a tree canopy, you don't want to have every inch of it with hyperspectral data, and then you've got a lot of good data and a bunch of bad data, and more data is not better data. Better data, less data that's better is how you want to do. You've sampled it, and then using that, now you can get a good understanding of using the indices and everything that are all designed and calibrated to use fully illuminated data. And then you can apply those and understand nitrogen or canopy composition or whatever it is you're interested in. So you have to do this pre-processing. You have to understand it. So what I just talked about was pre-processing within the forest itself, getting rid of that shade by sending the light down. However, there's another key component here, and that's the fact that the sun itself, the intensity of the sun is constantly varying because there's clouds and there's different types of atmospheric components, and there's different sun angles, etc. So it's key that you convert your radiance into reflectance. Otherwise, once again, you don't have data that you can use for much. And so there's a number of different ways to do that, and some are more common than others. The very simplest and most common way is what systems like the Neon AOP use. If you've heard about Neon, they have a aircraft with LiDAR and hyperspectral. They fly all around the US now on the largest billion dollar NSF grant that's ever happened, collecting lots of data. So basically they fly over, they collect radiance data, meaning they can see how much energy is coming off the ground in the different bands, but they have no idea exactly what's coming in. And then they use atmospheric transmission models. For example, Acorn or Atrem or Flash. These different types of models that exist. You put in it's about noon, it calculates the solar angle and the distance, and then it says what it thinks the atmosphere might be. It in no way can correct for things like clouds. So basically, you have to, in order for that to work, you need to be under absolutely perfect solar conditions, and preferably during a certain time of day within a couple hours. So that will get you, within some percentage, so they say. But, the truth is that most places you work, there's clouds and things like that. So then what people do is, well, there's clouds and things. We want to have something that actually starts to get an idea of those. So then people put tarps on the ground. Those are calibrated reflectance tarps. So basically, if you fly over and image that, then you can use that information to actually incorporate what the illumination, what the light was coming from the sun at the time you flew it over, and then use that to take your radiance to reflectance. And that's pretty good until the tarp conditions change, because you fly, for example, you fly over the tarp and there's a cloud in front of the sun, and then you go off to fly your whole flight, and 10 minutes later the clouds move, and you don't even know it, because half of your thing was under the cloud condition on the tarp, and then the rest, it had totally changed. And all of a sudden, you once again are back to needing to have homogeneous illumination conditions in order for that approach to work. And you need to fly your tarp multiple times. And so tarps can work. They can work well. Atmospheric transmission models can work well, but they have issues, meaning that they're not collecting the incoming light at all times. The next thing you can do, and we've worked our way through all of this, the next thing you can do is you can try to get a sensor to continuously record the incoming light, and then you can look at the reflectance from the drone, and then use that to calibrate. So this addresses the time component. We don't need to fly over the tarp and hope that it's going to be exactly the same for the next 15, 20 minutes. We actually have a value that's continuously recording it. And we did this for a while, and we would fly over and we'd go, hundreds of meters away, and we'd be collecting data over there. But in Florida, and we've worked in a lot of places, a lot of the time there's these puffy clouds, and they will go and they will shade your sensor, and then they're not shading, or it's a totally different kind of shade over where the drone is flying. And once again, it's time synchronized, but it's producing bad data. So this is the exact process that we went through working in ourselves, in our group, and then working with Phoenix to solve these. So then we said, well, we need to have this on the drone itself. Otherwise, we've solved time, but we have not solved space. And so then recently, we've actually successfully integrated a hyperspectral sensor looking on the top of the drone, which wasn't mentioned in that chart before. So now we actually measure time synchronized to 50 nanoseconds or something, the incoming light from the sun at the same time in the same exact place as where the nano is measuring coming up. And that means that once we've got this fully working, we're going to be able to fly under very varying light conditions and be getting reflectance values, because that's the ratio of the incoming to the amount coming up. The ratio, and you get your reflectance, and now you know what's happening, and you've dealt with all this other stuff. So we're trying to deal with it all because we don't want to have to talk about that. We just want to talk about ecology and the applications, and so and be able to fly when and where we want. So these are things that we've worked our way through, fusing LiDAR data, fusing all these other custom models that we're working on. So really exciting. So I'm about to jump to the next slide here. I just wanted to make sure my audio is still working well on my phone.
Yeah, sounds good. And that was incredible insight. Really fascinating to hear.
Thank you. So the pre-processing of data, there's a lot of absolute geniuses out there, mathematical geniuses, atmospheric science geniuses working on these issues to try to get this thing just absolutely perfectly usable. And we're working with a bunch of those types of people. And we've just in the last couple of days completed some script with Mateus Ferreira. He's a professor in Brazil, really great with hyperspectral data. And what we've been dealing with is another issue. And so I'm just going through the story of how we're solving issues before I start talking about how we're using the data, because you got to solve the issues. You don't have to have everything perfect. It depends on your question. It depends on how coarse of a resolution the things you're trying to do and distinguish are. And this is just, we're pushing it beyond to as vastly far as we can. So what I'm saying here does not mean that you need to do this. And it doesn't mean that if you don't do this, you don't have good data. It just means that this is about as far as it can be pushed and trying to get in the pre-processing stage as I'm aware of right now. So the BRDF, what is BRDF? That's the bidirectional reflectance function, or the bireflectance, I think it's BDRF, but yeah, I reversed it. So basically, you can imagine the complications here. Even if you're flying the same area and in about 5 minutes, well, you can assume that the sun itself is not going to move very far during those 5 minutes. But the drone and the sensor are. They're constantly moving around. And so your angle, your view angle of the sensor onto your forest canopy, onto your leaf, are different every single time you image it again, every single time you have overlap. So if you're doing flight lines, it might be that one flight line only has a 90-degree angle of difference between the incoming light and the outgoing to the sensor. But on the other lap, coming back on the flight line, it might be close to 170 degrees. So just intuitively, that's going to make a difference. You know, there's a very depends on what is the structure and the shape of the leaves and all these kinds of things. But there's going to be a big difference, and we don't want differences that aren't related to the ecology and physiology of our surfaces. So this is something else we're getting rid of. So using images that I've calculated that come up with all of those geometric angles, then Mateus has a very fancy code that can go through and actually remove a lot of those effects, so that we can, and you can see the result here from the top to the bottom. No, original. Oh, that's going to be a letdown. I provided both before. It's not a huge difference. It's not a huge difference, but it does adjust for some of the very minor flight line differences that are a result of that difference in the view angle. So all of these pre-processing corrections, where do they get you? They get you to that middle figure where you're seeing all these different types of reflectance spectra. This is now calibrated in space, calibrated in time for illumination, calibrated for BRDF angles, etc. And now this is what we get. We get a whole bunch of 270 bands of reflectance data. We should be able to fly it at different times of the day, on different days. If that plant isn't suffering more or less stress, then it should have a similar reflectance value. All of these little curves going up and down align with different types of information relating to the plant. You can see here how diverse a hyperspectral data cube for a tropical forest is on the right here. This is an area in Acre, Brazil, and you can looking from the top where it's darker, you can see is about 400 nanometers all the way down, going up through about 1,000, going all the way down. A lot more energy coming in, tons of information there. So you can go to the next one now. So yeah, we've got this great data set now, and so we've been really pushing ahead a lot of this algorithm development. Postdoc in my lab, he's in Danilo Giammaita is doing great work on that right now. He's also a LiDAR expert, so it's a pleasure to have him there, and we've been working hard on pushing this, the application side of this ahead. So for example, you can run 80 different vegetation indices. They all have different names, NDVI that you've heard about, normalized difference in vegetation index, and on and on. And these different ones these indices simplify the full amount of information in those 270 bands by selecting key bands that are known to relate to certain biophysical or chemical components of plants, and then trying to highlight what those are so you can look at stress and compositional differences. So so then that's really interesting, and it provides an opportunity to start to compare the intrinsic properties of LiDAR versus hyperspectral. So as I said before, LiDAR is about structure, but it has data on the other one. Hyperspectral is more about health, composition, but it has data on the other one. And you can see that here. So if we look at NDVI, for example, on this graph on the right, we can see that averaged over an entire plot, we actually are getting a fairly good relationship here with NDVI going up, LAI going up. So the LAI is the LiDAR-derived product from the structural density index, and the NDVI is a standard. It actually only uses 2 bands out of 270, and you know, plus minus ratio, and then you get your NDVI. So that looks pretty good over the plot scale, but the difference is in the 3D component. So you go down to the middle one here, and you can actually see that the LAI, that the NDVI saturates at very high leaf areas. And that's because it's an optical passive sensor. It's measuring data from the very top of the forest canopy. And so, you know, as that area gets filled up with leaves, you're just really not getting any information from what's underneath there anymore. And so your NDVI is going to saturate. Your ability and the obvious fact is your ability to look at understory forest interior dynamics using optical sensors is very limited. However, the LiDAR data is not limited by that. It goes through it all. It's sampling the entire forest from all different directions, and so you're getting that full structure. And that's why you see one down there. You're seeing one really really asymptote and saturate, and versus the other one which doesn't. However, when you look at the plot mean, you get these good relationships. So you can go to that in the next slide now. And so just further kind of summarizing, we're back where we started in this three-dimensional overlay of these different sensors. We've now learned about all these amazing things you can do with LiDAR to understand ecosystems, all these amazing things that you have to do to the hyperspectral if you want to work at it at a very, very fine, science academic level probably. And a lot of applications like crop health and land cover types only require a fraction of what I've even gotten into. And most people may not even think or know about what I'm talking about. And that's okay, because you're still getting great information and it works for you. I'm presenting as an applications person, but also as a scientist who's interested in pushing the theoretical limits of all of this and as well. So we come back and we've got our different sensors. They do different things in the same place at the same time. And we can see here that they're providing us different and unique types of information. So on the left-hand side here, a principal components analysis is highlighting both LiDAR metrics and hyperspectral metrics. And we can see that they're showing us different things, unique information. Understory LAI going straight down here, very correlated with PCA2, canopy height going off to the upper right, and then rugosity gap and above ground biomass being LiDAR derived. And then the PCAs being massive summaries of all the hyperspectral data going off in these different areas. So there's a lot of differences in the plots, and those plots are varying in species composition or richness from 20, I think we had 20, 60, and 120 different species in each one of those plots. So great area to be testing these algorithms and understanding how they interact, and really highlighting the advantages of having multiple sensors and giving you that sense of understanding of a place that we're accustomed to having, because it's what we have when we walk around every day, combining sounds, thermal on our skins, visual from our eyes. We don't really shoot lasers or anything, but we can hear things. So there's a sensor we don't have on the Gator Eye. Okay, next slide. I think that may have been my, oh yeah. Okay, so tell us about some recent projects. So we're applying these types of deliverables and questions all over the Americas at this moment. I didn't get into thermal data and the visual data and all of that, and that's a different conversation. But I did give you a pretty broad sweep through the challenges and opportunities associated with LiDAR and hyperspectral data and why it's exciting to be trying to fuse them. But these arrows represent places that we're currently working in, 14, 15 countries, and we're working all the way down through Central South America on all different types of projects relating to conservation biology, photosynthesis, above ground carbon storage, archaeological, detecting Mayan ruins in Mexico. We've got a couple big grants relating to that. Looking at hurricane disturbances in Apalachicola, selective logging in New England, and all this biodiversity project is actually the furthest right arrow down over there, and we have a bunch of other projects happening down there in cerrados and rainforests. So we have a lot of data. You should go to our website if you're interested in what I'm saying, gatoreye.org, and you can actually go and you can download data. We have LiDAR data available. You can download it, you can look at it and play around with it. And as we get more products, you can actually start downloading hyperspectral and visual and thermal and georeferenced visual data and things like that. So, yep. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Broadbent. That was, like I said, enlightening and fascinating.
You're welcome.
Now I think we'll maybe take a few minutes and see if there have been any incoming questions from any of the attendees that we can answer.
Conrad, would you like me to read a couple of questions?
Sure, Ben, if you've been monitoring them and have some, yes, please.
All right. Yeah, I had a look. The first question is actually, I'm not quite sure how related that is, but the question is whether you can monitor CO2 and NO2 levels in the air. So if hyperspectral is usable for that, and I'm pretty sure, Evan, that's not really your application, but maybe you've heard of that.
There's some fancy. A lot of that requires extremely fine signal to noise ratios and a lot of issues relating to the fact that the ground underneath you is constantly varying. So what's coming from different portions in the atmosphere that's relatively translucent is challenging. So I've heard of methane detection from aircraft-borne multi-million-dollar hyperspectral sensors, things like that. But in terms of from our system measuring like CO2, I mean, we're only flying sometimes 30 meters above the forest. So the goal is to have nothing changing in between there. I think that if there was a forest fire happening, that yeah, but that's going to be seen as like bad data and not as something that we could actually measure, and we wouldn't want to be flying in a forest fire anyways.
Okay.
Now
yeah.
we're more about impact point metrics.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's gas sensors and even using laser to see what's absorbed, and I think there's like special sensors for that. But
sure, yeah, you could mount a CO2 sensor on it, and then it could pump in air into a standard CO2 sensor or something else, and if you have it time synchronized and to the GPS, then you could be getting a map of something in your trajectory of those values, and that's like a totally different interesting sensor equation. There's lots of other sensors like SAR and radar and things like that. There's a lot of neat stuff down there, and bathymetric LiDAR and stuff. But in terms of what we have on our Gator, I know we don't do that.
okay. So possible, but likely hyperspectral wouldn't be the best approach of doing that.
No, it wouldn't be hyperspectral related. It would be IRGA, infrared gas analyzer. You get that's what you'd mount on there, a miniature one. People do it. It exists. It can be done. It's in fact it's not. It wouldn't be that challenging to try to make it happen.
Okay, thank you. Mike asked, which software do you use to process this data, TerraScan or other? So I think that's mostly focused on the LiDAR processing. Maybe.
LiDAR? Yeah, no, I mean, the great software right now is Spatial Explorer. There's tons of really good features in there. You can integrate your trajectories, which come from Inertial Explorer, or if you're using the LiDAR mill, then something similar. But basically, you get your differentially corrected Kalman filtered trajectory, and then you use that to know exactly where you are and where you're looking for the IMU, and then your sensors are all bore sighted separately and then time synchronized, so they all look, you can look at the same place at the same time. At that point, then you shoot your lasers down. You do that all in Spatial Explorer. You can get your point clouds. They can look really good. If they're not perfectly aligned, then there's ways to do alignment using LiDAR snap, things like that in Spatial Explorer. I've also played around with some other software for aligning things. If you do everything right, you fly your figure eights correctly, your flight line's going good, your base station's working correctly, you don't have any hardware malfunctions, then things line up pretty great, and you usually don't need to deal with additional alignment. However, if there's some issues, then there's options to make it fit as well. So then, but at that point, you've got your point cloud, beautiful point cloud, but you want products coming out of it. I use LAS tools a lot. I'm starting to explore some of the options in Spatial Explorer as well to get DEMs. But what I've been using for a while is LAS tools, and we've got workflows in there. It's fast. So, and then we get that, and then we just have a lot of just custom software in order to get some of those more complicated products that I was describing. That's all custom stuff in-house at the Gator Eye team.
And I'm not sure if that was the intent of the question, but I think it's an interesting question. So you have what I presume is quite a stockpile of custom software, right? That you share with researchers and you work on. Is that open source, or do you just meet people, start collaborations, and share with them, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, a lot of our software is in development, relatively new, but really we're about engaging in collaborations with people, and then because it's also uniquely tied into the intricacies of the hardware and everything, then we're about working collaborations with groups and then providing deliverables.
Okay.
And we have a lot of our approaches outlined in quite detail at the GatorEye website. You can go there and there's a paper that goes through the variety of different steps and in the theoretical kind of approach of what we do.
Okay, thank you. Joe, and you may, Joe McGlinchey, I hope I pronounced that name right, is asking who is making the light sensor. So I think that was what we integrated most recently.
Mm-hmm. So the one looking down is the Nano from Headwall, and the one looking up, we use a Flame. We found one that's in the same spectral range from about 400 to 1050, and then we get them lab calibrated to radiance by the separate companies. So which means that we have to, because one divided by the other equals the final unit, then it's important to keep those calibrated. So every year, send them back for recalibration. Or I suppose there's other ways to calibrate it in-house, even without having a NIST calibrated lamp, but maybe it would involve a tarp and then a smaller spectral on panel with a backpack field spec, and then kind of creating your thing, and then that might result in a calibrated system, but it gets complicated for other reasons. Yeah.
Thank you. One is asking, what is the criterion for knowing that the calibration of the data was done correctly? And I assume that's an answer you can extend or expand on quite a bit, right? It's very difficult to really be sure.
Yeah, there's different ways that you could do that. One, I mean, at some level, if you have sent it to a lab, they send it back with a lab calibration, with uncertainty values and it says it's valid for a year. Then at some level you need to trust that that's correct, because you can't pay $1,000 to recalibrate your flame every flight or something like that. So if it's good for a year, then you can use it. If you see any weird drift or something, then maybe that's an indication that you need to look more at it. So you've got some issues about using the lab radiance calibrations. However, there is relative within image variation that can happen, and different, because there's 640 pixels in the Nano, they can kind of drift independently from each other. And so we actually do a dark body, or not a dark body, but a dark electrical image collection, and we can do that as frequently as we want, because basically we just are in pitch black. We run the camera with the lens cap on, we run it for a minute, and then we turn it off. So when we actually go through the process of applying the digital number to radiance conversion, it'll incorporate all of the relative drift between the different pixels and get rid of them. And you can actually see that, because if you don't include, if you include a fake, perfectly standard electric dark image, then you'll see like stripes. You don't like stripes. But if you do the right dark electric, like a recent one, usually this seems to have very minor drifts, like on a level of a month or something, then those are gone.
Okay, so that's the calibration of the light sensor versus the hyperspec camera.
Yeah,
okay.
So if those are calibrated, and then assuming that the time synchronization and everything is good, then one divided by the other equals reflectance. And so if you wanted to further test that, then you could, I mean, it all ends up being, what do you trust more here or there? You could take a field spectrometer, for example, and if you had a large area like your driveway that was all very similar spectrally, and but then what you have to calibrate that to a smaller spectral on panel, which in order to get that lab calibrated, you send that to the lab, and they give you, everything ultimately gets tied back to NIST, if you actually care what you're doing. And that's the National Institute of Standards or something like that, that's in DC, and they, have the lamp and everything that's all calibrated. It's kind of like time. And what is time? It's all kind of continuously synchronized around the world, and there's standard times that drift very little, and that's NIST, but for spectra. So you try to get there. Anyways, I don't want to overwhelm you, confuse you.
Yeah, you're getting close. Okay, there's one application question that I thought was quite interesting. Christopher is asking, could you use the system to count individual Brazil nut fruit in a natural forest in Peru? And I have a feeling I know the answer, but I thought I'd let the expert speak.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it kind of gets back to what can you see. If you're just looking straight down or kind of even at the side some, then a lot of those might be blocking other ones. So then you'd have to develop some type of equations that would kind of account for, if you see one at the top, how many is it likely underneath there that you didn't see, and then you've got allometric style equations to try to count the number of Brazil nuts. However, is hyperspectral the best way to identify the Brazil nuts? I guess it would be how different is the hyperspectral signature from the surrounding branches and leaves. And in that case, it might be useful. It might also be that if you were really focused on one individual tree, that maybe using more like a very detailed visual camera and flying around it in circles and then doing like a photogrammetry, that might be a way to try. And then object-based image detection with less spectra might be a way to really start to identify the coconuts there.
Thank you. I have one last question. You showed a map of where you sampled data, and you said it was mostly the Americas. Is there a reason for that? Is it just enough to work in, or would it also be interesting to go through the like to scan in Asia or Europe? Or it seems you're very focused on the Americas.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in general in the tropical region. It just happens that most of my projects and key collaborators are based in the Americas right now, and it's easier logistically to get to those areas. However, I'm interested and have been under discussion with different collaborators for different different types of reasons to work in other places like Australia or Indonesia and Africa and things like that. So.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's probably. Oh, here's an interesting one. From Rob. Hi, Rob. What size areas are you scanning per project or flight? So you're using the M600, I believe, right?
Yep. So it depends on the part of the world we're in. What are the flight limitations, kind of legal issues like that, and it depends on the research questions. So the biggest thing that we've ever flown is in about 3 days. I think we flew like 30 to 40 square kilometers. That's a lot. That's like 80 flights in 2 days. It can be done.
Okay, so you have like your own charging crew. How many sets of batteries is that?
That would require, if I've got, well, when you're traveling to remote areas, bringing a lot of batteries can be actually challenging. For what can you bring on the airplane and carry on and stuff like that. So if I have 2 M600 battery chargers and 4 sets of batteries, which equals 24 batteries, then I can come close to flying near continuously, as long as I don't need to be moving around. So if you have a central place with energy, you can kind of branch out and fly a lot of areas.
Okay, I see. That's a very organized setup, it seems. There's one more question from Richard. I would like to use hyperspectral imaging to detect and reveal environmental crimes in the Amazon. Is there a way, for example, to detect mercury byproduct in these tailings of illegal gold mines using these technologies? And if so, how would you try to pick that up? Like which bandwidths?
Yeah, I'm sure that you could. And why am I sure that you could? Because if you look at Google Earth and you zoom into an area of gold mining in the Amazon, then you can see it from 800 kilometers up. You can see a lot of the contamination happening in the rivers. So going down to 120 meters or something with 10 centimeter hyperspectral pixels, absolutely, you're gonna see all types of things happening there. That would be a very different type of spectral analysis. The spectra would look completely different than what you get from leaves. It wouldn't be like chlorophyll and carotenoid and nitrogen and water content and stuff like that. That's not what you'd be seeing. You'd be entering more of a geologic type spectra, and I really haven't worked that much with it. However, a lot of people work mostly with that because that's what they're interested in. So there's a lot of interest and background experience in working with hyperspectral for geologic applications, minerals and things like that. And yeah, it's been happening for a long time. So it can be done. In terms of exactly what nanometers, et cetera, I think that, you know, if you had some data and you looked at it, it would be pretty obvious, I think.
So you're kind of hinting that it may just be visible in plain RGB data as well?
It depends at the level that you're at the level of what it is you're trying to assess. But no, I was saying that from Google Earth image from space, using RGB, you can see the contamination going down from, you know, illegal gold mining areas into the rivers and stuff, which contain huge amounts of mercury. Are you actually visualizing the mercury itself? Well, probably not directly. It's probably more of a correlation with sediment contamination and other types of things that happen downstream of these illegal gold mining areas, but you're seeing it. Now, if you wanted to, if you had a test case where you had two amounts of water that looked visually identical because they had a lot of sediments in them, and one you put in a certain concentration of mercury and the other you didn't have any, well, now that this is almost like a lab-based experiment. Well, now the visual sensor won't be working. Now, can the hyperspectral detect the mercury there that would otherwise be invisible to the human eye or via a correlation? And I think that you're going to have a lot better chance, yeah, because, you know, half of the data, even from the nano, is completely invisible to the human eye itself, and there's a lot of information out there. So I would need to Google what is the spectra reflectance of mercury look like, and then start thinking about, okay, now if it's mixed into a fluid, how does that change the reflectance a little bit, and think about that. But yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. June is asking, can the sensor be used on single copters, so I guess single rotor helicopters with engine vibration? Have you ever used it on a manned or even unmanned single rotor helicopter?
No.
Okay.
I think the engine vibration would be more of an issue for like getting your centimeter accuracy LiDAR points. But I think that because the vibration is going to be repetitive and kind of not massive, if it gets to a certain point, it'll just make everything impossible. But I mean, the pixels, hyperspectral pixels, are relatively larger, and they actually integrate in the direction that you're flying anyways. So I think a little vibration, it might cause you, you know, to have a little bit of energy input from maybe 20% from the surrounding pixels, but in the end, it's not going to be a big deal.
Yeah, from our experience, yes, vibration can be an issue, and we do use vibration dampening, and so do you, right? Even on the M600.
Yeah, no, I put it on there too. Yeah, we have your newer vibration dampening system. It's nice.
And we see that the vibration spectrum is obviously different between a single rotor helicopter and a multi-rotor drone, but the idea is always the same, to use vibration isolators and keep that away from your sensing elements. Yeah, maybe IMUs that are more sensitive than others, but in general, it's usually a solvable problem. Sometimes we see that when people switch vehicles a lot, or they don't use vibration dampeners at all, then yes, that can have an effect on data. But I don't think we've ever had a customer where this was like an ongoing problem. So
yeah, I mean, I was getting great LiDAR and even hyperspectral and visual data without the vibration dampeners, and just better with it.
Okay, I think we're well past the 1 hour. And Conrad, if you don't have anything else, then I think we'll conclude this.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for jumping into the question and answer. And Eben, thanks again. We really appreciate you joining in and discussing everything that you're up to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eben. It was very insightful.
Great to talk to you, Ben and Conrad.
All right, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.